The sound of tearing metal echoed through the cockpit as Ethan Ward struggled to control his ship. Sparks flew from the control panel, and red warning lights flashed like an alarm in his mind. The meteor storm had come out of nowhere, battering his small cargo vessel with chunks of frozen rock. Ethan gritted his teeth and yanked the controls, but the damage was already done. His ship groaned, shuddered, and finally plummeted through the atmosphere of an uncharted planet below. The impact was brutal. Ethan was thrown forward, his harness digging into his shoulders as the ship skidded across the icy surface. When the world stopped spinning, silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of damaged systems. Ethan exhaled shakily, checking himself for injuries. A cut above his eyebrow bled slightly, but he was otherwise intact. He unbuckled his harness and glanced out the cracked viewport. All he could see was an endless expanse of snow and ice, stretching into the horizon under a pale alien sky. The cold crept through the cracks in the hull, biting at his skin. "Great," he muttered to himself. "Just what I needed." He grabbed his emergency pack, a survival kit he always kept ready for such occasions. The first thing he did was check the ship's condition. The engines were beyond repair, the communication systems fried, and the heating barely functional. If he didn't figure something out soon, the cold alone would kill him. Ethan pulled on a heavy thermal jacket and stepped outside. The icy wind immediately hit him, stealing his breath. Every step crunched against the thick snow. The planet was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. He scanned the horizon, hoping for some sign of shelter or resources. Instead, he saw smoke rising in the distance, black and ominous against the white sky. Curiosity and desperation pushed him forward. It wasn't far, but trudging through the deep snow drained his strength. When he reached the source of the smoke, his heart sank. Another ship had crashed, this one far more alien than his own. The sleek, curved design and glowing blue symbols told him it belonged to an advanced civilization. Ethan approached cautiously, his breath visible in the freezing air. The ship was in worse shape than his. Its hull was torn open, and debris scattered across the snow like a trail of destruction. But what caught his attention was a figure lying just outside the wreckage. It was an alien, unmistakably. She was humanoid but different enough to make him pause. Her skin was a pale blue, almost glowing, and her long hair shimmered like silver. Strange patterns marked her face, almost like tattoos. She wasn't moving. Ethan hesitated. He didn't know anything about her species, her intentions, or if she was even alive. But as the wind howled around him, carrying the bitter cold, he realized one thing. If he left her there, she'd die. "All right," he muttered, kneeling beside her. "Let's hope this doesn't get me killed." He checked for signs of life. Her chest rose and fell faintly, and her skin, though icy cold, still had some warmth. She was alive, but barely. Ethan slipped off his glove and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was weak but steady. "You're coming with me," he said, more to himself than her. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body limp and fragile against him. Her clothing was minimal and clearly not designed for such extreme cold. Ethan wrapped his jacket tighter around her, shielding her from the wind as best as he could. The journey back to his ship was grueling. The extra weight slowed him down, and the snow seemed deeper with every step. His muscles burned, and the cold gnawed at his exposed skin. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The alien in his arms needed help, and she wasn't going to survive out here. When he finally reached the ship, Ethan stumbled inside, kicking the hatch closed behind him. The interior was dim and freezing, but it was better than the open snow. He laid the alien woman on a makeshift bed he fashioned from spare blankets and insulation. She didn't stir, her breathing shallow. Ethan worked quickly. He scavenged the remaining power in his ship's systems to boost the heating unit, directing what little warmth he could to their corner of the ship. He wrapped the alien in layers of fabric, hoping it would be enough. "Hang in there," he said softly, even though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. As the faint hum of the heater filled the air, Ethan sat back and studied the alien woman. He didn't know who she was or how she had ended up here, but one thing was certain. They were both trapped on this frozen planet, and if they wanted to survive, they would need each other. Ethan sat by the weak heater, rubbing his hands together to fight off the cold that still crept into the ship. The alien woman lay wrapped in layers of fabric, her pale blue skin stark against the dull gray of the blankets. He had no idea if what he was doing was helping or hurting her. For all he knew, her species could require some special treatment or substance to recover. But right now, warmth was all he had to offer. Every so often, her breathing would hitch, and Ethan would glance over nervously. He wasn't a doctor, and he certainly wasn't an expert on alien biology. Still, he refused to let her slip away. The silence of the freezing planet only deepened his resolve. If they were the only two living beings out here, they had to stick together. Hours passed, and Ethan's eyes grew heavy. Just as he was about to drift off, a faint sound startled him. He sat up straight, his heart racing. The alien woman stirred slightly, her fingers twitching under the blankets. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a striking, luminous violet color. For a moment, she just stared at him, confusion and fear flickering across her face. Ethan raised his hands, palms out, and spoke softly. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand the words, but his tone seemed to register. Her gaze darted around the small, damaged interior of the ship before settling back on him. She tried to sit up, but her body gave out, and she slumped back with a quiet groan. Ethan moved closer, slowly, careful not to startle her. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "Just rest. You're safe here." The woman frowned slightly, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to figure him out. Then, to his surprise, she spoke. The words were soft and melodic, but entirely alien. Ethan couldn't make sense of them, but the tone wasn't hostile. She was trying to communicate. "Yeah, I don't understand that," he admitted, scratching the back of his head. "But I get that you're confused. Same here." She sighed, frustration clear on her face. Slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed at herself. "Relara," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan blinked. "Relara, is that your name?" She tilted her head, as if considering his response, then nodded. Encouraged, Ethan pointed at himself. "Ethan." Her lips moved as she repeated, "Ethan." "That's right." He offered a small smile. "Ethan." For a moment, the tension in the air eased. Rylara's expression softened, though she still looked wary. Ethan leaned back, giving her space. Communication would be a challenge, but it was a start. They were no longer complete strangers. Over the next few hours, Ethan tried to make her more comfortable. He brought her water, which she drank cautiously, and offered some of his rations. To his relief, she accepted, though she seemed puzzled by the taste. At one point, she gestured to the broken pieces of her ship that he had brought back earlier. Ethan nodded and showed her the small pile of alien tech he'd managed to salvage. Her eyes lit up with recognition. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, ignoring Ethan's protests. She picked up one of the devices, a sleek, oval-shaped object, and examined it carefully. After a moment, she tapped a sequence of glowing symbols on its surface. A faint hum filled the air as the device powered on. Ethan watched, fascinated. "You can fix that." Relara didn't respond but seemed focused on her work. The device emitted a faint warmth, and she pressed it against her chest, sighing with relief. Ethan realized it must have been some kind of heat generator, designed to keep her body at a stable temperature. "Smart," he muttered. "I could use one of those." Relara glanced at him, then at the pile of parts. She picked up another object and began to tinker with it. Ethan couldn't tell what she was doing, but her movements were precise and deliberate. Despite her weakened state, she was clearly skilled with technology. As she worked, Ethan decided to check the ship's systems again. The heater was running on its last reserves, and the remaining power wouldn't last much longer. He glanced at Relara, who was still focused on repairing her equipment. If she could fix something that could help them survive, it might be their only chance. Time passed, and the ship grew colder. Ethan's breath was visible now, each exhale a reminder of how little time they had. Finally, Relara held up one of the devices with a small, triumphant smile. She gestured for Ethan to come closer, then handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. It looked like a small, portable heat source, though far more advanced than anything he'd seen before. Relara mind pressing it against his chest, and when he followed her instructions, warmth spread through his body. Ethan grinned. "You just saved us both, didn't you?" Relara gave a faint nod, her energy clearly waning again. Ethan helped her lie back down, wrapping the blankets tighter around her. He placed the device between them, letting its warmth spread through the small cabin. For the first time since the crash, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. They might not speak the same language, but they were starting to understand each other. And on this frozen, hostile planet, that was enough to keep them going. The frozen planet was relentless. The temperature dropped further as a fierce wind howled outside the battered ship. Inside, Ethan adjusted the alien heating device Relara had repaired, marveling at its efficiency. The small gadget radiated a comforting warmth, enough to keep both of them alive for now. But Ethan knew it was only a temporary solution. Supplies were running low, and the ship's systems were failing. Relara, though still weak, was beginning to regain her strength. Her alien physiology seemed to heal faster than a human's, but the cold continued to sap her energy. She sat cross-legged on the floor, examining another device from the pile Ethan had salvaged. Her focus was intense, her violet eyes scanning every detail as her delicate fingers worked to repair it. Ethan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Any chance that thing can call for help?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Their communication was still mostly limited to gestures and the occasional word they managed to teach each other. Relara glanced up at him, her expression serious. She held up the device and pointed at the sky, then shook her head. Ethan sighed. He didn't need a translation to understand. Whatever she was fixing couldn't send a signal powerful enough to reach her people. "Figures," he muttered. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. They couldn't stay here much longer. The ship's structure was creaking ominously, and the freezing wind was beginning to seep through the cracks. They needed to find better shelter, and fast. Relara suddenly stood, her legs wobbling slightly. Ethan instinctively reached out to steady her, and she gave him a small nod of thanks. She picked up a scrap of metal and began sketching in the thin layer of frost that coated the floor. Ethan crouched beside her, watching as she drew what looked like a map. Her fingers moved quickly, creating crude shapes that Ethan assumed represented landmarks. She pointed to one spot on the map, then gestured to herself and Ethan. She pointed to another spot, then mind shivering and collapsing. Ethan frowned. "You're saying we need to go here to survive?" Relara nodded. She tapped the first spot on the map, then made a circular motion with her hand, as if indicating warmth or safety. Ethan's gaze followed her gestures, and he nodded slowly. Whatever was at that location, it seemed like their best chance. "All right," he said, standing up. "If you think it's safe, we'll go, but we'd better be prepared. This planet isn't exactly friendly." Relara gave him a determined look, and together they began gathering what little they could carry. Ethan packed the heating device, some rations, and a makeshift toolkit. Relara collected the alien gadgets she'd been working on, tucking them carefully into a satchel she fashioned from scraps of fabric. When they stepped outside, the wind hit them like a wall. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, glancing at Relara to make sure she was okay. She had wrapped herself in multiple layers of cloth and carried a small device that emitted a faint heat, but even with her preparation, the cold visibly affected her. The journey was grueling. The snow was deep, and every step was a struggle. The icy wind whipped at their faces, carrying with it tiny shards of ice that stung like needles. Ethan kept a close eye on Relara, watching for any sign that she might collapse. She pushed forward with surprising determination, her alien features set in an expression of resolve. As they trudged through the snow, Ethan noticed something strange in the distance. A faint glow pulsed on the horizon, just barely visible through the swirling snow. He pointed it out to Relara, who stopped and squinted in the same direction. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded. "That's where we're going, isn't it?" Ethan asked, though he knew she couldn't answer. Her reaction told him enough. The glow grew brighter as they approached, but so did the dangers. The terrain became more treacherous, with jagged ice formations and hidden crevices that threatened to swallow them whole. At one point, Relara slipped, her foot catching on an icy ridge. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing her arm just in time to stop her from falling into a deep crack in the ice. "Careful," he said, his voice tight with concern. "We can't afford any accidents out here." Relara nodded, her breathing heavy, and they pressed on. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the source of the glow. A massive crevice in the ice revealed a hidden cavern below, its walls shimmering with bioluminescent light. The air inside was noticeably warmer, a stark contrast to the brutal cold above. Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. Relara knelt by the edge of the crevice, examining a narrow path that led down into the cavern. She looked back at Ethan and gestured for him to follow. Together, they carefully descended, using ropes and what little climbing gear they had. When they reached the bottom, the warmth enveloped them like a blanket. The cavern was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Strange, glowing plants sprouted from the walls, and small pools of water steamed gently in the dim light. For the first time since the crash, he felt a flicker of hope. "We might just make it," he said, glancing at Relara. She met his gaze and nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But even as they settled into the relative safety of the cavern, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their challenges were far from over. The warmth of the cavern was a welcome reprieve from the freezing winds above, but Ethan's instincts told him not to relax too much. This planet had already proven to be unpredictable and unforgiving. He glanced around the bioluminescent cavern, marveling at its alien beauty. Strange glowing plants lined the walls, their light casting eerie shadows across the crystalline ground. Pools of steaming water dotted the floor, the air around them humid but not unpleasant. Relara sat on a rock nearby, her delicate hands tracing patterns in the dirt. She seemed lost in thought, her violet eyes distant. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Did she miss her home? Did she have people out there searching for her? For now, those questions would remain unanswered. Breaking the silence, Ethan approached her and crouched down. "This place seems safe for now," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand but speaking anyway. "But we can't stay here forever. We need to figure out what's next." Relara looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. She gestured toward her satchel, pulling out one of the alien devices she had repaired. After a moment of fiddling with it, a small glowing projection appeared in the air. Ethan leaned closer, squinting at the image. It was a map, or at least that's what it looked like to him. "Is this the area?" he asked, pointing to the projection. Relara nodded and tapped a section of the map, highlighting it with a faint glow. She then gestured upward, toward the surface. Ethan frowned, trying to piece together what she was saying. "You're saying we need to go back up there?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Relara nodded again, her face serious. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Of course, can't ever catch a break. Despite his reluctance, he knew she was right. The cavern was a temporary refuge, but it wouldn't solve their long-term problems. If they wanted to survive, they needed to find a way to signal for help or at least gather more resources. He stood and adjusted the straps of his pack. "All right," he said. "Let's get moving." Relara rose to her feet, steadying herself against the rock wall. Though she still looked fragile, her determination was evident. Together, they packed up their limited supplies and prepared to climb back to the surface. The ascent was slow and painstaking, but they eventually emerged into the icy wasteland once more. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The snow stretched out endlessly, sparkling under the pale light of the planet's twin moons. Ethan shielded his eyes and scanned the horizon. In the distance, he could see a jagged mountain range, its peaks shrouded in mist. Relara pointed toward the mountains, her expression firm. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded. "That's where we're headed, isn't it?" She didn't respond verbally, but her actions spoke for themselves. She started walking, her stride purposeful despite the deep snow. Ethan fell into step beside her, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. As they traveled, the silence between them was both comforting and unsettling. Though they couldn't speak the same language, they had developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding. When Relara paused to examine the map on her device, Ethan would take the opportunity to check their surroundings for danger. When he stopped to catch his breath, she would wait patiently, her violet eyes scanning the horizon. Their journey was not without peril. As they crossed a frozen river, the ice beneath them began to crack. Ethan's heart raced as he motioned for Relara to stop. She froze in place, her expression tense. Slowly, they backtracked, moving one cautious step at a time until they reached solid ground. "Close call," Ethan muttered, glancing back at the fractured ice. Relara gave him a small nod, her face pale but resolute. The real danger came as they approached the base of the mountains. A low, guttural growl echoed through the air, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. He stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively reaching for the crude spear he had fashioned from a metal rod. Relara tensed beside him, her eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Emerging from the shadows was a massive creature, its body covered in thick, ice-like armor. Its glowing blue eyes locked onto them, and its claws scraped against the frozen ground. "Great," Ethan muttered. "Just what we needed." The creature roared and charged, its massive form barreling toward them. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. Relara, however, was already in motion. She pulled out a small device from her satchel and activated it. A bright beam of energy shot out, striking the creature and causing it to recoil with a screech. Ethan didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward with his spear, aiming for a gap in the creature's armor. The makeshift weapon struck true, and the creature let out a final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing. Breathing heavily, Ethan looked over at Relara. She was trembling but otherwise unharmed. He gave her a nod of gratitude. "Good work," he said. "We make a pretty good team." Relara managed a faint smile, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan felt a spark of hope. Together, they could survive this frozen nightmare. They just had to keep moving. The mountain loomed ahead, its jagged peaks cutting into the pale sky. Ethan and Relara trudged toward it, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Every step felt heavier as the snow deepened, but neither of them spoke. Words weren't needed anymore. They moved in unison, their silent partnership growing stronger with each passing hour. Relara occasionally checked the device in her hand, the glowing map guiding their path. Ethan followed her lead, his eyes constantly scanning for danger. The memory of the armored beast still lingered in his mind. This planet wasn't just cold and desolate. It was alive with threats. When they reached the base of the mountain, Ethan stopped and looked up. The cliffs were steep, and the path ahead seemed treacherous. He glanced at Relara, who was studying the terrain with a focused expression. She pointed to a narrow passage winding up the mountainside, then gestured to herself and Ethan. "That's the way?" Ethan asked, already knowing the answer. He sighed and adjusted the straps of his pack. "All right, let's do this." The climb was grueling. The rocky path was covered in ice, and one wrong step could send them tumbling into the abyss below. Ethan led the way, testing each foothold before signaling for Relara to follow. She moved with surprising agility, her alien physiology giving her an edge in balance and precision. Still, Ethan couldn't help but glance back frequently, making sure she was safe. Halfway up, the wind picked up, howling through the mountain like a ghostly wail. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and shielded his face, but the icy gusts still stung his skin. Relara stumbled behind him, and he reached out instinctively, grabbing her arm to steady her. She nodded in gratitude, her violet eyes meeting his for a brief moment before they continued. As they climbed higher, the passage narrowed, forcing them to squeeze through tight spaces and climb over jagged rocks. The effort was exhausting, but finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a plateau. Ethan collapsed onto the ground, his muscles burning from the effort. "We made it," he said between gasps of breath. He turned to Relara, who was kneeling beside him, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She gave him a tired smile, the faintest glimmer of relief in her eyes. But their moment of rest was short-lived. Relara pointed ahead, where the passage led into the mountain itself. A dark opening yawned before them, its edges jagged and unwelcoming. Ethan frowned. "A cave?" he asked. Relara nodded and gestured for him to follow. The air grew noticeably warmer as they entered the cave, the biting cold replaced by a humid stillness. Ethan's flashlight illuminated the space, revealing walls covered in strange, glowing crystals. The light reflected off their surfaces, casting shimmering patterns across the rocky interior. The cave was massive, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. Ethan stopped and turned to Relara. "What is this place?" he asked, even though he knew she couldn't answer. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the crystals with a look of wonder and recognition. She touched one gently, and the crystal pulsed faintly in response. As they ventured deeper, the cave began to reveal its secrets. Pools of steaming water dotted the floor, their surfaces rippling gently despite the absence of wind. Strange, bioluminescent plants grew in clusters, their tendrils swaying as if moved by an invisible force. Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This wasn't just a cave, it was a hidden world, alive and thriving in the heart of the frozen mountain. Relara knelt by one of the pools, examining the water. She dipped her fingers in and brought them to her lips, tasting it cautiously. When she didn't recoil, Ethan took that as a good sign. He knelt beside her and did the same, finding the water surprisingly warm and refreshing. "This is incredible," he said, looking around. "It's like the planet's heart is hidden in here." Relara didn't respond, but her actions spoke volumes. She began unpacking her satchel, pulling out the alien gadgets she had carried with her. Ethan watched as she worked, her hands moving with precision and purpose. She placed one of the devices on the ground and activated it. A faint hum filled the air, and a small holographic projection appeared, displaying what looked like energy readings. "You're scanning this place," Ethan guessed, "trying to figure out if it's safe, right?" Relara nodded, her focus unwavering. Ethan leaned back, letting her work. He felt a strange sense of calm here, as if the cave itself was offering them sanctuary. But even as he relaxed, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. This planet had thrown danger at them, at every turn. Could this place really be as safe as it seemed? Relara suddenly stopped and looked up, her expression serious. She pointed at the map projection, then at the far end of the cave. Ethan followed her gaze and saw another opening, smaller and darker than the one they had entered through. "You think there's something important in there?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. There was determination in her gaze, but also caution. Ethan sighed and stood. "All right, let's check it out. But let's be careful." As they moved toward the next opening, the air grew warmer still, and the faint sound of rushing water echoed through the cave. Whatever lay ahead, Ethan knew it was going to change everything. Ethan and Relara crept toward the darker opening at the far end of the cavern, their footsteps echoing softly against the crystalline walls. The sound of rushing water grew louder, accompanied by a low rhythmic rumble that made Ethan's stomach churn. He couldn't tell if it was natural or something alive, but whatever it was, it added to his growing unease. Relara led the way, her violet eyes scanning every corner of the passage ahead. She held her small alien scanner, its glowing display pulsing faintly as it gathered data. Ethan followed closely, gripping his makeshift spear tightly. The farther they went, the warmer it became. The air was thick with moisture, and faint steam rose from cracks in the ground. As they emerged into another chamber, both of them stopped in their tracks. The sight before them was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. A massive underground lake stretched out, its surface shimmering with a faint green glow. The source of the light was a colossal crystal formation in the center, pulsing like a giant heartbeat. The rhythmic rumble they had heard was coming from it. "What is this place?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Relara stepped closer to the edge of the lake, her scanner beeping more rapidly. She studied the readings with a focused expression, her brows furrowing slightly. Then she turned to Ethan and pointed at the crystal, gesturing for him to follow. Ethan hesitated. The crystal was mesmerizing, but something about it felt alive. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Relara nodded firmly, her determination unwavering. With a deep breath, Ethan followed her around the edge of the lake. The heat intensified as they approached the crystal, and the pulsing sound seemed to vibrate through his chest. Relara stopped a few meters away and knelt, setting her scanner on the ground. She began pulling components from her satchel, assembling them with swift, practiced movements. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, crouching beside her. Relara held up one of the completed devices and pointed to the crystal, then to the sky. Ethan's eyes widened in understanding. "You think this crystal can power a signal? To call for help?" She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she worked. Ethan watched her for a moment, impressed by her skill and determination. Then he stood and turned his attention back to the chamber. If they were going to stay here and send a signal, he needed to make sure nothing would interrupt them. He scanned the area, his grip tightening on his spear. The cave was eerily quiet except for the steady pulse of the crystal. But Ethan had learned by now that silence didn't mean safety. He moved to the edge of the lake, peering into its glowing depths. The water was clear but impossibly deep, and he thought he saw something move far below. A sudden hiss echoed through the chamber, sharp and unnatural. Ethan spun around, his heart racing. From a dark corner of the cave, a creature emerged, smaller than the armored beast they had faced earlier, but no less threatening. Its sleek, ice-blue body glistened in the dim light, and its glowing eyes locked onto Ethan with predatory intent. "Relara," Ethan shouted, stepping between her and the creature. She looked up from her work, her expression alarmed. Ethan raised his spear, keeping his eyes on the creature as it crept closer. The creature let out another hiss, bearing rows of sharp, translucent teeth. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to think of a plan. The chamber offered little in the way of cover, and the creature moved with a fluid, serpentine grace that made it clear it was built for this environment. Relara stood behind him, her hands gripping one of her devices tightly. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and saw her adjusting it, her fingers flying over its controls. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast," he yelled. The creature lunged, and Ethan reacted instinctively. He dodged to the side, thrusting his spear at its exposed flank. The weapon struck true, but the creature's slick body twisted away before he could do any real damage. It snarled and circled him, its movements quick and deliberate. Relara suddenly shouted something in her language, her voice sharp and commanding. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he saw the device in her hands emit a bright burst of energy. The creature screeched and recoiled, its body writhing as the energy struck it. Seizing the opportunity, Ethan lunged again, this time driving his spear into the creature's side. It let out a final agonized cry before collapsing into the water. Ethan stood over it, breathing heavily. His hands trembled as he pulled the spear free. "That was close," he muttered, turning to Relara. She gave him a quick nod and gestured for him to come back to the crystal. Her device was nearly complete, its components glowing faintly as they sensed with the crystal's pulse. Ethan watched as she placed the final piece, and the entire setup came to life. A beam of light shot upward, piercing through the cavern's ceiling and disappearing into the sky. Relara stepped back, her expression a mix of relief and hope. Ethan followed her gaze, watching the beam with a small smile. "You did it," he said. "Now let's hope someone sees it." As the beam continued to shine, the rhythmic pulsing of the crystal seemed to grow quieter, as if it was finally at peace. Ethan and Relara sat together near the edge of the lake, the glow of the crystal reflecting in their eyes. For the first time in days, Ethan felt like they might actually have a chance. The beam of light from the crystal continued to pierce the cavern ceiling, a steady reminder that hope was now in motion. Ethan sat with Relara near the glowing lake, exhaustion finally catching up with him. His body ached from the climb, the fight, and the endless tension of survival. Yet, for the first time since the crash, he felt a sliver of relief. Relara, sitting beside him, looked up at the beam with a soft, almost hopeful expression. She said something in her language, her voice quiet and melodic, but Ethan didn't need a translation to understand. She was thanking him. "You don't need to thank me," Ethan said, giving her a tired smile. "We've both kept each other alive." Relara tilted her head, studying him as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. She finally nodded, her gaze softening. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, their breathing the only sound in the cavern aside from the faint hum of the crystal. Hours passed, though time felt meaningless in the stillness of the cave. Ethan's eyes were growing heavy when a faint sound reached his ears, a low, distant hum that wasn't coming from the crystal. He sat up, his senses immediately on high alert. "Do you hear that?" he asked, looking at Relara. She nodded, her eyes widening as she stood and grabbed her scanner. The device lit up with readings, and her expression shifted from concern to hope. She gestured for Ethan to follow, moving quickly toward the cave's entrance. Ethan scrambled to his feet, grabbing his pack and spear. As they climbed back toward the surface, the hum grew louder, accompanied by flashes of light in the sky. When they finally emerged into the freezing air, Ethan's heart leaped at the sight above them. A massive ship hovered in the distance, its sleek design and glowing symbols unmistakably alien. Smaller crafts broke away from it, descending toward their location. Ethan turned to Relara, whose face was alight with relief. She waved her arms toward the crafts, signaling their position. "They're coming for you," Ethan said, a mixture of relief and sadness settling in his chest. The crafts landed nearby, their engines hissing as ramps extended to the ground. Alien figures emerged, their forms similar to Relara's but taller and more imposing. They moved with precision, their weapons held at the ready. Ethan tensed instinctively, his grip tightening on his spear. Relara stepped forward, speaking quickly in her language. The aliens listened, their postures relaxing as she explained the situation. One of them approached Ethan, their gaze sharp but curious. Ethan stood his ground, meeting their eyes without flinching. After a moment, the alien gave a short nod and gestured to Relara. She turned to Ethan, her expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper. She said something softly, then placed a hand over her heart, a gesture he had come to understand as a sign of deep thanks. Ethan smiled faintly and mirrored the gesture. "You're welcome, Relara. I'm glad you're going home." Relara hesitated for a moment, then reached into her satchel. She pulled out a small glowing crystal, the same kind that powered her devices, and pressed it into Ethan's hand. He looked at it, then at her, confused. "What's this?" he asked. She motioned to the sky, then to him, as if saying it was a way for him to call for help, should he ever need it. Ethan nodded, understanding the gesture. "I'll keep it safe." Before he could say anything else, the aliens motioned for Relara to board one of the crafts. She gave Ethan one last, lingering look before turning and walking up the ramp. The craft's engines hummed to life, and within moments it was airborne, disappearing into the massive ship above. Ethan stood alone in the snow, watching as the ship ascended into the sky. A sense of quiet settled over him. He was still stranded on the freezing planet, but he no longer felt as hopeless as before. The small crystal in his hand was a lifeline, a promise that he wasn't truly alone anymore. He turned back toward the cave, his breath visible in the icy air. There was still work to be done. Shelter to maintain, supplies to find. But for the first time in days, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. He had survived this long, and now he had something to hold on to. Help would come, eventually. As he walked back to the cavern, Ethan glanced up at the sky, where the alien ship had vanished. He didn't know if he'd ever see Relara again, but he hoped that wherever she was, she would remember the human who had helped her. And he, in turn, would never forget the alien who had taught him the value of trust and resilience, even in the harshest of worlds.